So we heard about, this morning, we heard about strategy, and then we heard about politics, and it falls to me to talk to you about technology. And what I want to do is put some technologies on your radar that I think you should know about if you don't know about them already, because they're potentially very disruptive indeed. And we have a very nice example of this, and just how disruptive technologies can be, that we've had in the past 10 years. Does anyone know what this is a picture of? It's popes, exactly. So the top picture is when Pope Benedict was announced, and the bottom one is when Pope Francis was announced. And what's striking is that almost no one in the top picture has a mobile phone, and everybody has one in the bottom picture. In fact, there's even somebody taking a picture with an iPad, which is it's a surefire way to look like an idiot, if you ask me. But anyway, you get the general picture, which is that this is a technology that has gone from being pretty obscure to being ubiquitous extremely quickly. In fact, I had a smartphone 10 years ago. I had a phone called the Nokia 3650. Does anyone remember that one? It had the buttons, that's right, it had the buttons set out in a circle like a dial. So it was skeuomorphism, anachronism. It was great. And the thing about that phone was it could go on the internet. It had a camera, kind of. It took kind of postage stamp images. And you could download apps on it. There was a particularly good version of Tomb Raider for it, in fact, which I remember playing. And so this was something that only a few nutters did. Mostly gamers, actually, would bother to download apps on their phone. But the point was it was doable 10 years ago, and there were just a few people doing it. And that suggests that there will be other technologies that similarly, there are a few nutters interested in them now, but they could potentially be everywhere in 10 years' time. And so here's a nice quote from William Gibson, the sci-fi writer, encapsulating this idea, which is that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So it's all about knowing where to look to see the future. And in fact, in the case of smartphones, the place that I and many other people went to look in 2001 was Japan. Japan was the first country in the world to have 3G networks, to have phones that could take pictures, had color screens. And I remember seeing a Japanese speaker at a conference in Sweden about telecoms, and he got out some of these phones and passed them around, and people were just like, and they couldn't believe them. It was like these objects had fallen out of the future, and in a sense they had. So Japan was the place in the world that you went to see that part of the future that we've all now caught up with and indeed surpassed. And in fact, Wired magazine used to have a column called Japanese Schoolgirl Watch, which sounds a bit dodgy. But what it actually meant was, the idea was that what Japanese schoolgirls do today, the rest of us will be doing in 10 years' time. So it's worth watching what they're doing. Anyway, so if you look at smartphones then, you can see they've spread incredibly quickly. They've disrupted lots and lots of industries. So obviously they've disrupted the telecoms industry. We heard about this this morning. We've heard that Nokia and BlackBerry have fallen by the wayside as a result of being unable to keep up with the shifts in smartphones. It's also disrupted the computer industry. So Intel and Microsoft very much on the back foot because they've been blindsided by the shift towards mobile computing. And it's had political and social knock-on effects as well. Going back to Japan again, a really odd thing about Japan is when you're on the underground in Japan, you look on your phone and you've got 5 bars of coverage. No one is talking. And this is because the social negotiation that takes place around technologies when they appear, this whole question of whether it's acceptable to take a phone call at the table or that sort of thing. The conclusion of that in Japan was that even though they have very, very good coverage on the underground in Tokyo, you shouldn't use it. And you should just restrict yourself to messaging and playing games and that sort of thing. And that was the outcome they had. We're still struggling with what are the sort of social implications of social media and phones. And my wife likes to get up on her chair and take pictures of meals in restaurants, which some people find embarrassing. Similarly, has anyone played that game where you all have to put your smartphones in your pocket when you sit down at a meal at a restaurant, and the first person to get their phone out has to pick up the bill? And let me tell you, that keeps the smartphones locked away. So the point is that there have been social impacts here, and of course there have been political impacts to these devices as well. Probably most strikingly, Mohamed Bouazizi, who was the fruit seller who set himself on fire and sort of was the spark that started the Arab Spring. What actually happened was that his family filmed, members of his family filmed the silent protest that followed his death. And it was the footage of that which they managed to get onto YouTube that was then picked up by Al Jazeera, and that meant that other people in Tunisia could see what was going on, and they had the police running into all the cafes in Tunisia trying to get them to turn off the TVs, because for the first time a local protest could actually spread nationally, and then of course it spread throughout the region as well. So phones have had this enormous impact, very, very disruptive, not just politically, socially, and in business as well. So where are the things in the present now that are glimpses of the future that are the sorts of things that could have a similar impact? So I'm going to give you 3 of them. Here's the first one. It's a self-driving car. This is not the Google self-driving car, which you might be surprised to see. And I think that's because the Google self-driving car is incredibly cool, but I think it can give you a slightly misleading impression of how this technology is going to play out. The Google car can pretty much drive itself as long as it stays in California, and it can't do sort of off-road stuff. It's probably not much good in snow, and it still has problems with roadworks. But essentially, so it just sort of gives up and says, okay, fair enough. But you may have seen the lovely video where it picks somebody up and takes him out to go shopping, and it turns out at the end of the film that he's blind. And so he's able to do this because he has a car that can drive itself. And I think this gives people the impression that self-driving cars, there's going to be a sort of switch that's flicked, and one year we all buy cars that can drive themselves. In fact, the transition is going to be much more gradual than that, and it's already visible, it's already happening. So you can already buy a car that slams the brakes on if it sees someone step in front of the car. You can already buy a car that maintains a constant distance from the car in front, which is called adaptive cruise control. You can already buy a car that does lane keeping. So if you start to drift out of your lane, it either shakes the steering wheel to warn you, or it actually turns the steering wheel. And all you have to do is put those 3 things together, and you have a car that can drive itself in stop-go traffic. So it follows the car in front, and so when you're just stuck on the M25 or wherever, you can just let the car drive itself. And there are cars in the 2014 model year that will do this. So there's a Volvo X70 that will do it. There's a BMW electric car that will do it. I believe there's a Mercedes S-Class as well. So essentially, although Google gets written about, all of the car makers have got self-driving cars. This one's a BMW, but and they've all started to actually put these features into the cars. And as a result, if you buy one of these cars, your car might be able to drive itself, depending on how much you get into traffic jams, maybe 5% of the time, 10% of the time. And what we're going to see is that percentage going up, and it's going to go up over the next decade, very gradually, but there will be more and more situations where your car can drive itself, and if you're the kind of person that doesn't really enjoy driving, then you'll be able to ask it to drive itself. And Elon Musk of Tesla recently said that his company has the ambition of building a car that can drive itself 90% of the time by 2020. So he's an engineer, and he thinks about these things. He's not claiming 100% of the time. He's saying they'll get to 90. So let's assume this is the case, and this technology gradually gets better. It's out there already. I think it's quite an informative example for many reasons. The origin of all of this stuff was something that DARPA, which is the research arm of the American military, did. And they held something called a Grand Challenge. And what they wanted was essentially trucks that could drive themselves in Afghanistan. They were losing a lot of vehicles and people to IEDs. And they thought, well, if we have robot trucks and you just teach them the route and they can do it themselves, that would be great. So they held this challenge, and they did the first one in 2004. And they had cars, and they were supposed to complete a 30-mile course. And one of them got 7 miles, and none of the others really got anywhere at all. So it really did look like they'd set the bar very high, and it was a very, very difficult problem. The following year, they held another version of it, and that year, all but one of the cars went more than 7 miles, and 5 of them completed the course. So the astonishing thing is that this went from being an insoluble problem in 2004 to being solved independently by 5 separate groups in 2005. And that made the car makers wake up, because this was Carnegie Mellon and Stanford and people like that. In fact, the guy at Stanford then went to Google. But the point was the car makers could see that this was a solved problem, because lots of academics had solved it. And so they realized that this wasn't the insurmountable, difficult problem they thought it was, and they all got cracking, and now we have the first fruits of this actually appearing on the market. So let's think about what the implications of this would be. Well, they're quite enormous. For one thing, if you have a car that can drive itself 90% of the time, you don't need the controls 90% of the time. So the design of the car changes. You actually want something like a sort of business class airline seat with a little cupboard where you open it and pull out a PlayStation controller when you actually need to drive the car. But most of the time, you're just going to leave the PlayStation controller there. And it's, So that's good. It's going to change the design of cars. But then, well, maybe it will change whether or not you need to actually own a car, because if you could summon a car with your smartphone whenever you needed one, and there were just loads of these cars out there, or you could tell a car to go and pick up Granny from the airport, then you wouldn't actually need to own your own car. So that would change the way that car makers sell things. Who would they sell? Who would operate these fleets? I don't know. Maybe they'd be like competing networks, like there are competing mobile networks. But it would be a very, very different world. And already we see young people don't define themselves through their cars. They're driving much later. They're learning to drive much later. And instead, they're defining themselves through their mobile devices. So smartphones are the new cars. Anyway, so this could completely change the way the car industry sells its product and markets its product. But then it goes a bit further again, because then insurance, well, suddenly you're not insuring the drivers, you're insuring the network operators of the cars, and you're probably insuring the car makers as well, because car makers are a big, juicy target for the lawyers. And we saw exactly this happen with private planes. That what happened with private planes was that the makers of private planes had to have massive indemnity insurance, because every time someone crashed a plane into a building and then got sued, well, of course, they couldn't get sued because they were dead, and it's not a very good idea to sue the family of the pilot because they're a bit cut up about it all. So what do? You sue the plane maker. And this meant that planes became more and more expensive because of the massive, massive indemnity insurance that was necessary. Eventually, the government had to step in. So this starts to have sort of policy implications for car insurance as well. So this is blown up now, car making, and it's blown up car insurance. It also blows up logistics, delivery, and taxi company, their business models. That doesn't really work anymore. And it starts to affect employment, because you don't need those delivery drivers, you don't need those taxi drivers. So this is starting to get quite significant. It could also mean that you don't need as many roads. You can pack more cars onto, if they're driving themselves, onto the road than you can if you've got humans driving them. And that means that you don't need things like parking lots in the middle of cities, and you don't need to have maybe motorways that go through the middle of cities. Maybe you can turn some of those back into parks. Who knows? So this potentially starts to change city planning as well. And it's very clear in America in particular that cities have been built around the car. But we could see a complete reversal in that. So this is a massive, massive shift, which I think could happen a lot more quickly than people expect. And I think the reason that this is sort of creeping up on us is that most people don't recognize that this is a gradual transition to cars that drive themselves, that more and more of the time your car drives itself. It's not going to be an overnight, where's the BMW I can buy tomorrow that works like the Google car. So the Google stuff is very, very interesting, but it's not really, I don't think, representative of how this is going to be rolled out. It's representative of where this is going to go. So that's the first one of my 3 examples. Second one, here's another car. I know it looks like it's made of Lego. It's actually not. This car has been produced on a 3D printer. So you can just about, if you look very, very close to it, you can see that it's kind of stripy here. This is actually quite an old picture. It's 3 or 4 years old, and 3D printers have got quite a lot better since this. And it's also at about 200% scale to actual Lego, if you're familiar with what technical Lego looks like. But I think the point is that this is an example of the kind of complexity that you can produce with a 3D printer. You know how laser printer prints out a funny pattern when you do the test page? Well, 3D printers print out pieces of clockwork when you want to test them, with moving gears that actually mesh and so forth. So rather than calling this 3D printing, though, I want to draw your attention to the broader field of digital manufacturing, and because this is really part of a broader trend. But essentially what happens with 3D printing, sometimes called additive manufacturing, is that you build up a shape, a layer at a time. And this sort of thing is done by a nozzle that spits out plastic. There are actually other ways you can do it. You can have a bed of metal powder, and you can zap it either with an electron beam or with a laser to make it stick together in certain places. And you can then make shapes that it's impossible to make in any other way. So we often, when we hear about 3D printers, and if you've seen them in the newspapers or the TV, you basically see something this big that prints out plastic. Well, that's just the most visible tip of a very big iceberg. And in fact, the really important stuff that's being done with 3D printing, well, the world's biggest 3D printer is in China. It's 12 meters long, and it spits out aircraft parts in titanium. And they're using them to build their rival short-range jet to go up against Boeing and Airbus. And this gives them a huge advantage, because you can print the strut for an aircraft with a 3D printer so that it has a foamy pattern inside it, like a bone does. You know what the inside of a bone looks like? And that's incredibly strong but incredibly light. And you could never have made this by milling out the inside of a strut, because you can't get to the inside of it. But with 3D printing, you can make something that's much stronger, much lighter, produces much less waste, 90% less waste if you're making a titanium aircraft strut. And that's the kind of thing that's very significant here. The other thing it does at the other end of the scale is that it allows you to prototype much more quickly. So you might prototype in plastic and then print in metal later. Or you might prototype in plastic and then you might switch to injection molding later. So again, as with self-driving cars, I think there's a sort of misconception that needs to be swatted away. The misconception with self-driving cars, as we go straight to the Google model, the misconception with 3D printing and with digital manufacturing is that it's sort of going to replace mass production. And actually what's going to happen is it's going to hybridize with mass production. That's what's already happening. And so there are some very clever things that are being done to combine the best of both of these approaches. But another misconception, I think, that needs to be looked at is that this is going to be bad for China, which does a lot of manufacturing now, and good for the rest of the world. There's going to be reshoring of manufacturing. Now, there's already a certain amount of reshoring going on, and this may help in some regard because you can have faster cycles of innovation and production close to the market where you're delivering things. But I would just hesitate to go down this road that China is going to lose out here, because China's manufacturers are as well placed as anyone, if not better, to embrace the good things about 3D printing. And in fact, there's an awful lot of innovation going on in China with 3D printing. So I suspect that they're going to use this to try and keep themselves, move up the value chain, and keep the manufacturing services that they offer to others still very competitive. My favorite example from China is actually that Chinese astronauts have seats that are 3D printed to perfectly match the shape of their bottoms. And this keeps them comfortable when they're blasting off into orbit. Now, again, this has the potential to transform all sorts of industries. So this is already widely used in the medical and dental fields. So dental braces obviously have to be tailored to the individual customer, patient, and the great thing about 3D printing is that since you're printing each item individually, you can customize them all for no extra cost. So you don't get the economies of scale, but complexity doesn't cost you any extra. So it's actually quite complementary with mass production in that regard. And so there's a company that prints clear dental braces, and they printed something like 17 million of them last year alone using 3D printing technology. Another lovely example from the medical field was a woman who had bone cancer in her jaw. She had to have her lower jaw removed, and they were able to actually, in the same operation, replace it with a custom-made titanium jaw that they had made by scanning the bone while it was still in her, cleaning up the bone because of the damage done to it by the cancer, and then using that mold to create the new jaw and putting it straight in. And otherwise, she faced months of having to drink through a straw or eat through a straw while they created a new jaw and so on. We're also seeing 3D printing being used by surgeons to practice particularly difficult surgeries. So you can 3D print a model of a patient, a particular anatomy where there's a delicate organ that's surrounded by a cancer, and they can actually practice on it. So that's all great, but that doesn't sound like it's going to sort of shake up particular industries. The industries that will be shaken up by this, I think, you've got I think manufacturing will be transformed by this, and that's potentially quite significant. You can prototype a lot faster. You could probably have small-scale manufacturing in a way that you didn't have before, because you can essentially this lowers the barrier to entry, and you can prototype, you can test, you can see that things work. You can even use these things to supply your lead customers, and then once you've shown there's market demand, you can switch to mass production. So it gives you a much smoother on-ramp to mass production than you would otherwise have, and I think that's going to mean that we get a lot more innovation than we've had in many, many areas. But I think probably the things that people are most familiar with that this could be very disruptive about, firstly, you could get piracy of objects. So in the same way that Napster was very bad news for the music industry because instead of buying CDs, we could just download tracks. Then imagine what this could do to Lego. Lego is very worried about this. They actually have a team working on how to make 3D printing their friend. And I hope they come up with a model because I'm a big fan of Lego. But you can imagine, pirate plans for Lego parts, minifigures, this sort of thing, floating around on the internet. Now, that said, you could make a virtue out of this. It may be that instead of having a logistics supply chain to supply spare parts for particular things, you would actually create them in local centres you'd have a big library of plans and you'd print them out. It's entirely plausible that a bit of your vacuum cleaner breaks, you download the plan for it, and you take it to your friend or the local print shop that has a 3D printer and print it out. But the piracy could have the ease with which you can essentially download objects could have a dark side as well. Piracy is one bit of it, and then of course there's the infamous example of 3D printed guns. So there are people who are developing 3D plans for guns because they're really, really big fans of the Second Amendment and everyone being able to have easy access to guns. To be honest, access to guns doesn't seem to be that big a problem in America. So I'm really, I'm not quite sure what problem they're trying to solve, but I think, were the government to sort of magically spirit them all away overnight, they are very reassured that they might be able to print out some more. 3D printing is actually a pretty terrible way to print a gun barrel. It's much easier just to go to a hardware store and buy a pipe. And again, but this is the sort of thing that I think could bring on the need for legislation around 3D printing. And we're already hearing the first rumblings of that. So I think, again, there's a lot of hype talked about this, and some of it's slightly off base, but it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. And then the third technology is the $1,000 genome. So this is how much it costs to sequence a genome. The Human Genome Project, which was completed during the 1990s, cost $3 billion, and it did a handful of genomes. The method that emerged from that, shotgun sequencing, by 2001 could sequence a single genome for $100 million. And as you can see, this is a log scale chart. It's dropped very quickly since then. The green line is how much it costs to sequence a genome, and it's now down at about the beginning of last year, it was down at about $3,000, and it should fall to about $1,000 this year. It's also gone from taking a decade to taking about 48 hours. And the problem is that this is great, but as you can see, the white line is not dropping as fast as the green line. The white line is how fast computers get cheaper, which we're used to thinking of as, they get cheaper pretty fast. And this means that the data coming out of these sequences is growing in volume faster than the computers can keep up with it. So this is going to be a software problem. But if we can solve that problem, it's a big data problem, then there are some potentially extraordinary things that can be done with this technology. Already, we've had the first examples of patients who are being diagnosed by having their complete genome sequenced. So newborns who have some mysterious thing, they really don't know what it is. They sequence the whole genome to find out what it is. I think it's entirely plausible that within a decade, everyone will have their genome sequenced. If not at birth, then as soon as they have any kind of serious investigation done. Because there's very useful stuff you can do with this. You can do things like whole genome comparisons. So you can work out, if you've got a large, and the British government is embarked on a project to do this. If you've got 100,000 genomes, you can start to look at which genes correspond to which diseases. You can start to work out which drugs work in which subsets of the population. We're used to the idea that a drug like aspirin will work for me and it'll work for you and it'll work for everyone in this room. But we're now running up into the limits of that approach, and we're starting to have to tailor drugs to individual patients. In cancer therapy in particular, what you do is you sequence the genome of the cancer itself, and which turns out to be quite a wide target, but you can then tailor the therapy doing that. So this is all very cool, and there's great potential for improving medical treatment, medical diagnosis, and making drugs work more efficiently. But this could also be hugely disruptive. One of the things this will do is if you can actually figure out who's at risk and who's not, then it blows up the whole model for health insurance, because health insurance is about pooling risk, and if I know I'm not going to get anything nasty and you know that you are, then your premium is going to be very high and I'm not going to take out insurance at all. And that in turn means that if you're going to have health insurance, then you need to have compulsory risk pooling, which kind of means you need to have an NHS-like single payer socialized medicine system. So this has political implications as well, which could just come out of the fact that sequencing genomes costs a tiny fraction of what it used to. So I think this is a really fascinating technology. Now, I've put this one last just because there is a history in genomics that scientists have repeatedly been over-optimistic about how quickly they're going to get results out of it. It turned out with the Human Genome Project, we thought that there was a simple relationship between genes and proteins, and it turned out to be more complicated. There are epigenetic mechanisms than we thought. So this could all take much longer than we think, but I think it's really worth keeping an eye on for the next 10 years or so, because I think it could be hugely significant. So those are my three, and those are sort of three particular things that, even if they're not in your industry, they could affect the industry that you're in. And they could affect your life and how it plays out. And then the fourth thing I'd just quickly like to draw your attention to, and I'm afraid this slide is not on the memory sticks. Here it is. It's a rather colourful slide. but I have just tweeted it, so if you're interested in the study. This is a study done by the Oxford Martin Group, and they are a group of academics at Oxford who are into some really crazy stuff, like transhumanism, and they're philosophers, and they're into AI, and I think they're great. They have done a mathematical model looking at the impact of computerization on employment, but specifically looking at the extent to which it can affect white-collar workers. So we're not talking about robots replacing people building cars. We're talking about robots replacing legal clerks, and so forth. And what they did was they built a model that looks at the various skills that you need to do different jobs, like manual dexterity, like pattern recognition. And they then looked at how rapid progress was in each of those fields, and how likely it was that computers would be able to do those as well as humans within the next 20 years. And what they concluded, this is actually a model of the US workforce, and they concluded in the middle that 47% of people in the workforce are at high risk of having their jobs doable by computers within 20 years. And they helpfully divide this up by industry. I'm very pleased to see that the kind of business that I work in, which is media and creative stuff, is much harder to replace. But this is bad news if you're a legal clerk. Essentially, what they have is a probability of 0 down here, and so the more chips you have stacked up down here, the more your industry is harder to computerize, or your activity. And then 1 up here means it's much easier to computerize. Now, this is the sort of discussion that is, we've been used to what will happen to the car workers of Detroit. But the question is, will this affect white-collar workers more broadly? Will it affect the kind of jobs that we need to do? This does suggest that we need to have a shift towards the sorts of things that computers are bad at. And it also suggests that there's a sort of hollowing out going on, that you get people who are in very creative, very complicated industries that require a lot of education are fine. And then people who do really boring grunt work, like when the robot misses something on the conveyor belt or knocks something over, they have to pick it all up, because that's obviously the kind of thing robots are rubbish at. But there's an awful lot of people in the middle who are potentially in danger here. And what are they going to switch to? And we've seen this happen before. Obviously, the Industrial Revolution was a switch from most people working in agriculture to most people not working in agriculture. That's what the Industrial Revolution is, to working in manufacturing. And so the question is, where are people going to go next? Probably into services and creative stuff. But the Industrial Revolution gave us more than a century to make that adjustment, and we could have to make this adjustment much more quickly in this case. So the reason I'm ending up here is that this looks like it might actually accelerate the problem of income inequality increasing and of median household income stagnating. And that's caused by technology, but at that point it becomes a political problem. You might need a new political settlement, a new social contract, and it also potentially becomes an economic problem, because our social security nets and so on are set up to assume that the workforce and the labour market works in a particular way. So the usual economist prescriptions for this would be we need flexible labour markets, we need greater emphasis on education and retraining and so on. But it's very, very hard to make a dent in something if it's going to happen in 20 years. As I say, this looks like, to me, it could turn into quite a nasty political and economic problem. But since I'm here to talk about technology, that's not my problem, and I'm going to hand that over to other people and leave it at that. Thank you very much.